She believed manipulation was her greatest weapon. Not brute force, not chaotic violence, just cold, calculated control. From the outside, she seemed untouchable. A woman who could bend reality itself to her will with nothing more than a glance, a carefully chosen word, or a strategic silence. Everyone around her, investigators, friends, even the justice system, fell under her spell. They didn't see a criminal. They saw a victim, a grieving wife, a tragic figure caught in circumstances beyond her control. But beneath that carefully crafted facade was a mind working like a surgical scalpel, carving out a crime so perfect it seemed impossible to unravel. This was not a story of passion or rage. There were no violent outbursts, no fiery confrontations. Instead, it was a chess game played in the shadows, where every move was deliberate, every silence loud with meaning. She didn't need to raise her voice or her hand. Her greatest weapon was the illusion she created, the story she told, the emotions she manipulated, the doubts she planted. She orchestrated a narrative so convincing that even the most seasoned investigators found themselves questioning their own instincts. Witnesses, too, became unwitting actors in her drama. Their memories and perceptions shaped and reshaped until they aligned perfectly with her version of events. Her confidence was unshakable. She understood the fragile nature of truth, how it could be twisted and bent to suit her needs. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent, using both as tools to guide the investigation away from the real story. It wasn't about hiding evidence or fabricating alibis. It was about controlling the narrative so tightly that the truth became invisible. She was a master of psychological precision, a puppeteer pulling strings no one even realized existed. Yet, as flawless as her manipulation seemed, something small, an overlooked detail, completely indifferent to emotion or intent, waited quietly in the background. It didn't scream for attention or demand to be noticed. It was a silent witness, a technical fact that contradicted everything she had so carefully constructed. While she focused on controlling people, she missed the one thing that couldn't be controlled by charm or deception. This isn't a story about a dramatic confession or a high-speed chase. There are no explosive reveals or desperate attempts to escape justice. Instead, it's about the slow, inevitable unraveling of a crime that was only perfect in appearance. The very thing she believed gave her power would become her undoing. And when that silent, logical truth finally comes to light, it will shatter the illusion and expose the master manipulator for what she truly is. What follows is a tale of confidence and control, of a mind so sharp it deceived an entire system, until one small detail broke everything. Keep watching. The perfect crime is about to fall apart. There's a subtle thread woven into the story, barely noticeable at first glance, that unravels everything. It's not in the flashy evidence or the loud confessions. It hides in the quiet moments, the spaces between what's said and what's left unsaid. As this case unfolds, you'll see how a single misstep, almost invisible, turns the tide and brings the carefully crafted facade crashing down. Keep your mind open and your eyes sharp. The truth doesn't announce itself. It waits patiently to be uncovered. Long before the first shadow of suspicion ever crossed anyone's mind, she had already begun the meticulous work of shaping who she appeared to be. This was not a matter of chance or fleeting impulse. It was an enterprise of precision and patience. Every smile, every gesture, every carefully measured word fit into a larger design, one that ensured she would be seen as reliable, sincere, and utterly ordinary. The artfulness of her demeanor lay in its seamless naturalness, so convincing that it never invited doubt. Her emotional calibration was subtle yet exacting. She mastered the delicate balance of warmth and restraint, never too effusive to seem insincere, never too distant to raise alarm. In social settings, her laughter was timed just right, her eyes reflecting an attentive kindness that drew people in without overwhelming them. She practiced these expressions until they became second nature, rehearsing the roles she'd play in various scenarios. From the supportive wife to the attentive friend, the calm presence in moments of stress, the gracious hostess in gatherings. Each reaction was honed to align perfectly with the expectations of those around her, ensuring her responses felt predictable and trustworthy. Consistency was the backbone of her persona. Over months and years, she nurtured a pattern of behavior that left no room for surprise. Her interactions were marked by a steadiness that comforted others, a rhythm that made her presence familiar and safe. She avoided extremes. No sudden outbursts, no erratic decisions, no revealing slips of frustration or anger. Instead, she cultivated a veneer of equanimity so polished that any deviation would have seemed out of character, thus unlikely to be suspected. This constancy built a reservoir of goodwill and trust that would later shield her from scrutiny. Behind closed doors, her calculated control did not waver. Private moments were rehearsed as carefully as public ones, if not more so. She anticipated the questions, the doubts, the moments when her composure might be tested, and prepared her responses accordingly. Her private self was not a wild, unpredictable force but a measured extension of her public image, maintaining the same calm, collected facade. This internal discipline was essential, as it prevented cracks from appearing when the pressure inevitably mounted. Her efforts extended beyond mere behavior to the cultivation of a narrative, a story of who she was, told through small, consistent details. She shared just enough personal information to seem open but never enough to invite deep inquiry. She aligned herself with socially acceptable values and interests, projecting an image that was unremarkable in the best way possible. People found it easy to trust her because she mirrored their expectations so perfectly. She was, in essence, the embodiment of predictability, which paradoxically made her all the more inscrutable. This was not manipulation born of desperation or a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a long-term strategy executed with clinical precision. Every interaction was an investment in credibility, every gesture a brick in the foundation of her carefully constructed identity. She understood that true deception lies not in overt lies but in the omission of disruption, in the artful maintenance of a seamless facade. Because she made everything seem natural, all her behavior was accepted at face value, leaving no room for suspicion to take root. In the end, what made her so effective was precisely how unremarkable she appeared. She was neither flamboyant nor withdrawn, neither too perfect nor too flawed. She was simply consistent, and that consistency became the very shield that concealed the truth. It is in this quiet mastery of self-presentation, this deliberate cultivation of trust, that the seeds of her eventual downfall were sown, waiting patiently beneath the surface for the faintest misstep to unravel the illusion she had so carefully engineered. The morning after everything vanished, the apartment sat in an eerie stillness, untouched by chaos yet stripped of presence. The air held a faint trace of the usual, her favorite lavender candle, now burned down to the wick, the soft hum of the refrigerator maintaining its cold vigil. Nothing appeared out of place. No signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no displaced furniture. The front door locked securely from the inside, its polished brass handle gleaming under the soft glow of the hallway light. It was a scene that whispered normalcy, a place where nothing had ever gone wrong. Investigators arrived with cautious professionalism, their eyes searching for the slightest sign of disruption. Yet each step revealed nothing amiss. Her belongings were where she had always left them. A pair of reading glasses resting atop an open book on the coffee table, a half-empty mug of tea on the kitchen counter, the cushions on the couch carefully aligned as if awaiting her return. The subtle arrangement spoke of routine, not of panic or hurried departure. It was as if she had simply stepped away, leaving behind the ordinary markers of daily life. The absence of struggle was particularly striking. No overturned chairs, no scuffed floors, no traces of a desperate fight for survival. The silence was unbroken, the space unaltered. Even the faint scent of her perfume lingered delicately in the air, undisturbed by chaos. It was a setting designed to reassure, to lull observers into accepting the most benign explanation. The scene suggested a voluntary absence, a temporary retreat rather than anything sinister. Her personal documents and valuables remained untouched. Wallet, keys, phone, all accounted for, neatly placed as if waiting for use. There was no sign of theft, no hurried packing or frantic searching for escape. The meticulous orderliness of the apartment mirrored her own consistent demeanor. Deliberate, controlled, unyielding. It was a reflection of a mind that had left no room for error, no loose ends to unravel. In the days that followed, neighbors recounted their routine encounters with her, brief greetings exchanged over the mailbox, the familiar silhouette seen through the window at dusk, the steady rhythm of her life unfolding with quiet predictability. None noticed anything amiss. No unusual visitors, no late-night disturbances, no whispers of concern. To the casual observer, everything aligned perfectly with the story of a woman who had simply chosen to step away, perhaps for a brief respite or a change of scenery. Even the forensic sweep yielded nothing but silence. No fingerprints beyond her own, no fibers inconsistent with the environment, no trace evidence hinting at an intruder. It was a void where answers might have been found, a blank canvas resisting interpretation. The crime scene was less a scene of crime and more a tableau of absence, a carefully composed still life that defied the instincts of those trained to detect disruption. This absence, this lack of evidence, became its own kind of puzzle. How could something so definitive have happened without leaving the faintest ripple? The investigators were left with questions that circled without landing, their theories unable to penetrate the seamless fabric of normality. It was as if the crime had been choreographed to perfection, each detail meticulously arranged to avoid suspicion, to evade detection. And yet, beneath this flawless exterior, a subtle unease persisted, an instinctive recognition that the ordinary had been weaponized, that the very familiarity and quiet order were the hallmarks of something far more calculated. The perfect crime, in its devastating precision, had left nothing behind but the unsettling absence of itself. She never uttered a direct falsehood. Instead, she wove a delicate web of suggestion, guiding those around her down paths she carefully cleared in advance. The mastery of her manipulation lay not in fabricating facts, but in choreographing their perception. Every pause, every glance, every carefully modulated tone became a tool to shape understanding without ever overtly distorting reality. Timing was her most effective weapon. She waited for moments when the air was thick with uncertainty, when investigators were hungry for answers, eager to grasp any thread that might lead to clarity. In these moments, she would offer minimal responses, never too much, never too little, allowing suspicions to form and settle according to the contours she had subtly outlined. A well-placed silence, pregnant with implication, invited the listener to fill the void with their own assumptions. She understood that people are often more compelled by what is unspoken than by what is said outright. Her emotional cues were equally strategic. She deployed grief and vulnerability with precision, never allowing her sorrow to appear rehearsed, but always just intense enough to disarm. A tear, a tremor in her voice, a fleeting look of confusion. All these signals coaxed empathy and lowered defenses. The investigators, caught in the currents of their own compassion, found themselves less critical, less probing. The woman's sorrow became a shield, a subtle barrier against the harshness of scrutiny. When responding to questions, she framed her answers carefully, choosing words that were technically true but laden with ambiguity. She navigated around direct accusations with grace, often redirecting attention through vague or elliptical phrasing. By doing so, she created a labyrinth of interpretations, each one plausible, none definitively incriminating. The investigators unknowingly charted a course through this maze, their conclusions bending toward the impressions she cultivated rather than the unvarnished facts. Her control over perception extended to the sequencing of information. She revealed details in increments, never allowing the full picture to emerge too quickly. Each revelation was a carefully measured drop in the ocean of uncertainty, enough to satisfy immediate queries but insufficient to prompt deeper investigations. This gradual disclosure maintained a narrative rhythm that kept the inquiry confined within the bounds she set, preventing it from spiraling into dangerous territory. In interviews, her demeanor was composed yet approachable, inviting trust without demanding it. This balance made her presence disarming. She seemed cooperative, transparent even, while subtly steering the conversation away from uncomfortable angles. Investigators, eager to believe in her cooperation, often missed the understated signals that hinted at deeper concealments. Their focus narrowed to the surface of her words, ignoring the currents flowing beneath. She also exploited the natural tendencies of human cognition, confirmation bias, and the desire for coherence. By feeding investigators small, consistent details that aligned with their emerging theories, she reinforced their confidence in flawed conclusions. They began to see patterns where none existed, mistaking her guided narratives for genuine leads. The woman's manipulation was not in rewriting the story, but in nudging the storytellers to embrace the version she orchestrated. Throughout the process, she maintained an aura of innocence that was difficult to challenge. Her adherence to truth in its barest form created a paradox. She was both honest and deceptive, transparent and opaque. This duality unsettled those seeking clear answers, trapping them in uncertainty and doubt. The very authenticity of her statements became her camouflage, blunting the edge of suspicion. In the end, the investigators found themselves prisoners of her subtle control. Their inquiries mapped onto the territory she had quietly shaped. They chased shadows cast by her carefully curated responses, mistaking them for the contours of reality. She did not need to distort facts. She had already mastered the art of manipulating the human mind to see what she wanted them to see. In this silent domination of perception, she held the true power, an invisible command over the narrative that would evade reckoning, at least for a while longer. Weeks slipped by with a rhythm so predictable it lulled even the most diligent investigators into complacency. The initial surge of urgency that had electrified the department slowly dissipated, replaced by a steady cadence of routine updates and perfunctory interviews. Reports arrived on desks like clockwork, their pages filled with the same carefully curated fragments of information, none of which pierced the fog of uncertainty. The excitement that once fueled late-night strategy sessions dwindled, and the case began to dissolve into the background noise of everyday police work. Detectives who had once chased every lead with relentless fervor now found themselves cycling through the same set of witnesses, their questions growing more mechanical with each repetition. The interviews became exercises in monotony rather than discovery, as if the answers were rehearsed lines in a play they had seen too many times before. There was no new evidence to ignite the investigation, no breakthrough to shatter the growing inertia. The case had become a puzzle with missing pieces that no one could find, and slowly, those pieces ceased to matter. As the urgency waned, so too did the pressure on her. The carefully constructed image she had maintained began to solidify into an unshakable fortress of confidence. She moved through her days with a quiet assurance, aware that the scrutiny that once threatened to unravel her was now diluted by indifference. The eyes that had once pierced through her veneer now glanced away, distracted by fresher stories and more immediate crises. Without the weight of suspicion bearing down on her, her veneer of calm transformed into genuine composure. The subtle shifts in the investigation's momentum were not marked by dramatic announcements or formal closures. There was no definitive statement declaring the case unsolved or abandoned. Instead, the fading was organic, a natural drift away from a story that had lost its spark. Meeting rooms once filled with intense discussion now echoed with polite nods and half-hearted exchanges. The media, which had once hung on every detail, gradually redirected their gaze towards newer headlines, leaving behind a quiet space where the case quietly slipped into obscurity. Within this growing void, her sense of control deepened. Each day without a fresh lead felt like a small victory, a silent confirmation that her design was succeeding. The perfect crime, in its imperceptible perfection, was thriving in the very gaps left by those who sought to expose it. She no longer needed to actively manipulate. The natural course of fading attention was doing the work for her. The narrative was no longer under siege but gently allowed to settle into a state of unresolved calm. Her confidence was not born of arrogance but of strategic patience. She understood the power of time and the human tendency to move on. The investigation's slow decline mirrored her own ascent into a space where suspicion was a distant memory, replaced by a quiet certainty that the truth would remain buried. The absence of closure became her greatest ally, a silent accomplice in the ongoing success of a plan executed with invisible precision. In the end, the investigation became less about finding answers and more about preserving the illusion of pursuit. The routine reports, the repeated interviews, and the diminishing urgency were all part of a carefully choreographed dance, one that ensured no real progress was made. As the case faded from the headlines and the minds of those who once chased it, she stood resilient, her triumph hidden in the very silence that marked the investigation's slow retreat. The perfect crime was not just surviving, it was quietly winning. Amid the sprawling mass of documents that filled the case file, there was one detail that had quietly settled into the margins from the very beginning. It was so small, so technical, that it never caught anyone's eye. Not the detectives who pored over witness statements, not the forensic experts who examined every shred of evidence, and certainly not the journalists who once chased the story with fervor. Yet, it was there, unchanging and untouched, like a whisper lost in a storm. The detail was a timestamp embedded deep within the digital logs of the victim's security system. Unlike the more visible elements, the alibis, the surveillance footage, the forensic reports, this timestamp was neither emotional nor subjective. It bore no trace of memory or testimony. It was a simple, unembellished record of when a specific sensor had last been triggered. The sensor monitored the motion detector on the back door of the victim's residence, a device designed to catch any unauthorized entry. According to the logs, the sensor had been activated at precisely 2:17 a.m. on the night in question. This information was noted in the initial forensic reports, referenced once or twice by officers compiling timelines, and then largely forgotten. It was never questioned, rarely highlighted, and never given more than a passing glance. It was a number, a data point, a line of code in an otherwise sprawling narrative filled with human drama and conflicting accounts. No one ever asked why the sensor had triggered at that exact moment, nor what it might imply. It simply existed, a silent fixture in the case's digital landscape. What made this detail particularly peculiar, though, was how it stood apart from everything else. Every other piece of evidence relied on something human: an eyewitness's memory, a suspect's statement, a forensic analyst's interpretation. This timestamp was immune to those frailties. It was not something that could be misremembered, distorted by trauma, or skewed by bias. It was pure, cold data, as objective as a heartbeat recorded on a monitor. Yet, despite its objectivity, the detail was never integrated into the broader understanding of the crime. The investigators never sought to align it with other events, never considered if the motion sensor's activation might signal the arrival or departure of someone crucial. It lingered in the background, never interrogated, as if it were a cog in a machine whose function had long been accepted without question. In the months that followed, as the investigation ebbed and flowed, that timestamp remained static. It was a fixed point in the otherwise shifting sands of speculation and conjecture. No one revisited it, and no one connected it with the slight anomalies scattered elsewhere in the case file, like the unexplained gap in the surveillance footage or the unusual pattern of the victim's phone records. It was as if, by virtue of its technical nature, it had been relegated to a quiet corner, overlooked because it did not fit the narrative's emotional or human dimensions. There was a subtle unease beneath the surface, a feeling that perhaps something was being missed, not through negligence, but through a collective blind spot. The timestamp was there from the start, a fact as undeniable as the crime itself, yet it hovered without explanation, untouched by the rush to assign meaning elsewhere. It was a detail that refused to be ignored entirely, yet it was never quite embraced either. This quiet persistence of the unexplained timestamp cast a faint shadow over the case, a reminder that sometimes the smallest, most technical elements carry weight far beyond their apparent insignificance. It was a detail that waited patiently, as if biding its time, silent but not inert, a ghostly thread weaving through the fabric of the investigation, present from the beginning, but never truly understood. The investigators returned to the timeline with renewed scrutiny, setting aside assumptions about motive or opportunity. They gathered every recorded moment, every timestamp, every logged event, and began to align them one after another, as if reconstructing the very pulse of that fateful day. The sequence became their focus, the order of events treated not as mere background but as the potential key to unraveling the mystery. It started with the surveillance footage. The recordings were clear, yet, when examined frame by frame, subtle anomalies emerged. A door that was supposed to close at precisely 3:17 p.m. lingered open just a fraction longer, while a shadow cast by a passing figure appeared milliseconds before the official timestamp suggested. The investigators noted these discrepancies without rushing to conclusions, cataloging them carefully. The sequence did not flow as smoothly as it should have. Instead, it stuttered, revealing gaps that refused to be easily explained. Next, the digital logs from the victims' devices were revisited. Each file accessed, every message sent, every application opened was placed on the timeline. Here, too, inconsistencies surfaced. An email, supposedly sent at 2:43 p.m., appeared in the recipient's inbox before the sender's device recorded its dispatch. The investigators cross-referenced server logs, delivery times, and user activity, but the sequence stubbornly resisted coherence. These mismatches weren't due to simple error. They suggested a distortion in the flow of events, subtle enough to evade immediate detection but significant enough to cast doubt on the accepted timeline. The physical evidence was then reconsidered with the same chronological lens. The time indicated on the victim's wristwatch stopped at 3:21 p.m., a detail initially overlooked. Yet, the forensic team confirmed that the watch's mechanism ceased functioning before the estimated time of death. It was a small but telling inconsistency. If the watch stopped earlier, could the assumed timeline of the crime itself be inaccurate? The investigators reasoned that if one element of the timeline faltered, the entire sequence might be compromised. Witness statements, often prone to emotional bias, were set aside temporarily in favor of the hard data. However, upon aligning memories with the recorded timeline, contradictions emerged. One witness reported seeing the victim enter the building at 3:10 p.m., but security logs placed the victim inside only after 3:15 p.m. Another claimed to have heard a disturbance at 3:25 p.m., yet audio sensors recorded silence during that exact interval. The chronological discrepancies accumulated, not in isolation but as a pattern, an undercurrent of temporal dissonance threading through the case. As the investigators pieced these elements together, the tension built, not through dramatic revelations, but through the steady unraveling of order. The timeline, once thought straightforward, became a labyrinth. Each attempt to reconcile the discrepancies led to more questions. How could a single minute be fractured in such a way? Could the sequence itself have been manipulated, or was it simply flawed from the start? The methodical approach revealed no immediate answers, only a growing awareness that time was not the neutral backdrop it appeared to be. Instead, it was active, almost conspiratorial, an unseen force shaping the narrative, obscuring truth beneath layers of temporal complexity. The investigation took on a new dimension, no longer focused on who or why, but on when and how the very flow of moments could betray the facts. Without leaping to explanation, the investigators let the timeline speak for itself. They documented the inconsistencies with precision, aware that these fractures might hold the key to understanding the entire case. The clock, once an impartial measure, had become suspect. Its hands no longer simply marked moments but cast shadows where clarity should have been. In this shift from motive to moment, the case deepened. The investigators embraced logic, dissecting each second, each tick, until the timeline's secrets could no longer be ignored. The sequence was no longer a mere record. It was the silent witness, the reluctant culprit, the real suspect in a crime where time itself had become the ultimate enigma. She had always placed unwavering faith in the fragile nature of human memory, convinced that the fallibility of perception would shield her plan from scrutiny. It was this very assumption that had become the foundation of her confidence, a belief that memories would blur, eyewitnesses would falter, and the intricate details of her involvement would slip through the cracks of collective recollection. She counted on the natural imperfections of the human mind, the way time distorts, how stress clouds judgment, and how even the most vivid moments inevitably dissolve into hazy fragments. For her, this was the perfect camouflage, the invisible thread weaving through the chaos that only she fully understood. Yet, as the investigation unfolded, an uncomfortable truth began to surface. Unlike human memory, systems and passive records bore no such weakness. They did not forget, did not mishear, nor did they reinterpret events through the lens of emotion or bias. Each logged second, each automated timestamp, each silent, Mechanical, I captured a reality immune to the distortions she had so confidently exploited. These digital archives, cold and indifferent, held the power to expose the discrepancies between what was recalled and what actually transpired. Her reliance on the fallibility of memory had blinded her to this vulnerability. She had dismissed the significance of these systems, treating them as mere background noise rather than the unyielding witnesses they were becoming. The logs, once overlooked, were now demanding attention. They offered a stark contrast to the shifting sands of human testimony, their precision unyielding and unforgiving. The very tools designed to document and verify events threatened to unravel the fabric of her carefully constructed narrative. As she reviewed the growing mountain of data, a subtle unease began to creep in. There was a dissonance, a faint but persistent misalignment between her expectations and the reality recorded by these impartial observers. The timelines, once malleable in the minds of those involved, now stood rigid and unyielding. The sequence of events, so meticulously rehearsed in her mind, did not always correspond with the digital footprints left behind. Small inconsistencies emerged, timestamps that contradicted her carefully curated recollections, sensor logs that refused to corroborate her version of the story. This realization did not strike as a sudden collapse but as a creeping awareness, a gradual dawning that something was amiss. The confidence that had once fortified her resolve began to waver, replaced by a quiet, gnawing doubt. Her plan had been built on an assumption so fundamental that she had never thought to question it, that memory's imperfections would be her greatest ally. Now, faced with the unblinking eye of technology, that assumption seemed less like an advantage and more like a blind spot. She understood, in that moment, that the systems she had underestimated were not simply passive records but active participants in the unfolding drama. They were impartial arbiters, immune to persuasion or manipulation, their logs silent yet potent testimonies that refused to be rewritten. In contrast to the fluidity of human perception, these systems rendered a fixed truth, a truth that did not bend to narrative or convenience. Her strategy had depended on control over the intangible, the ephemeral nature of memory and human error. But the more she confronted the unyielding evidence, the clearer it became that this control was an illusion. The logs were meticulous, their accuracy unchallenged, and their existence a constant reminder that some truths are beyond the reach of forgetfulness or distortion. In this uneasy space between certainty and doubt, she found herself confronting a vulnerability she had never anticipated. The very foundation of her plan, the assumption that memory's fallibility was her safeguard, had been quietly eroding beneath her. Yet, she stopped short of despair, caught instead in the silent tension of a discrepancy not yet fully understood. The shadow cast by this realization was subtle but undeniable, hinting at fractures beneath the surface that had yet to reveal their full extent. The final piece lay in an almost imperceptible inconsistency, one so minor it could have been dismissed by anyone less meticulous. Yet, for her, it was the axis on which the entire narrative turned. The timeline she had crafted with such care depended on a seamless chain of events, each link forged by her calculated movements and the deliberate absence of witnesses. But the evidence, when re-examined with precision, told a different story, one that quietly dismantled the entire facade. It began with a simple, overlooked detail, a timestamp on a surveillance camera located several blocks from the scene. The camera's clock was synchronized with the city's official timekeeping system, a fact that lent it an unassailable credibility. According to its footage, she was captured entering a cafe at precisely the moment she claimed to be miles away, orchestrating the perfect alibi. The difference was negligible, mere minutes, but enough to shatter the illusion of her unshakable presence elsewhere. This discrepancy did not provoke an immediate confrontation or an overt accusation. Instead, it seeded a growing certainty that the entire story she told relied on a temporal impossibility. The crime's success hinged on her ability to be two places at once, and this detail, quiet and unyielding, proved otherwise. It was not a flaw born of chaos or clumsiness, but a miscalculation within an otherwise flawless design. She had banked on the inherent unreliability of human memory to protect her narrative, expecting that any conflicting testimony or evidence could be subtly undermined or rationalized. Instead, an objective, mechanical element, an impartial device immune to bias or error, exposed the weakness. The camera's unblinking lens did not lie. It did not forget or confuse. It simply recorded, its evidence waiting patiently to be uncovered. Further analysis of the digital logs revealed another layer to the contradiction. The system's integrity checks confirmed no tampering had occurred, ruling out the possibility of a manipulated record. In this way, the evidence transcended subjective doubt, resting on irrefutable proof. The timeline she constructed collapsed not in a blaze of dramatic revelation but through the cold arithmetic of time and place. She revisited her assumptions, retracing every step of her plan. The precision with which she had eliminated witnesses, controlled variables, and anticipated potential pitfalls now seemed overshadowed by a fundamental oversight. The synchronization of her movements was not as perfect as she had believed. The detail was minute, almost trivial, yet its implications were profound. This silent collapse of her narrative was not accompanied by frantic attempts to explain or deny. Instead, it unfolded in the quiet spaces between moments, in the careful scrutiny of data and the logical unraveling of her story. The crime did not fail because of impulsiveness or error in execution, but because of the unyielding demands of precision itself. The very rigor she had applied to the plan rendered it vulnerable to the smallest inconsistency. The paradox was clear. Perfection requires absolute control, but absolute control leaves no room for error. In this case, the absence of chaos was not a strength but a vulnerability. The flaw was not in the complexity of the plan, but in the assumption that such complexity could be flawlessly sustained. A single, silent contradiction was enough to unravel the entire construct. In the end, the failure was not dramatic or conspicuous. It was a quiet inevitability, a logical consequence of the unyielding standards she had set for herself. The perfect crime did not collapse in a storm of revelations, but in the steady, unrelenting light of precision, where even the smallest detail carries the weight of truth. In the end, the illusion of control is exactly that, an illusion. No matter how meticulously a plan is crafted, no matter how flawlessly one believes they have manipulated the world and the people around them, there is always a variable beyond reach. The ego, that insistent voice whispering of invincibility and superiority, can blind even the sharpest minds to the subtle fractures beneath their carefully constructed facades. Her downfall wasn't born from a grand mistake or a moment of reckless arrogance. Instead, it sprouted from a quiet contradiction, an overlooked detail that silently defied her narrative and quietly unraveled her entire scheme. This detail was not glaring or dramatic. It did not shout for attention, nor did it demand acknowledgement. It existed in the spaces between her words, in the shadows of her rehearsed alibis, in the faintest inconsistency that only the most precise scrutiny could reveal. It was a testament to the truth that control is never absolute, and no amount of manipulation can fully erase the marks left by human imperfection. The failure was not a collapse, but a steady, inevitable unraveling, a reminder that even perfection is vulnerable when pitted against reality's unyielding standards. Her ego, fueled by the belief that she could orchestrate every aspect of the crime without leaving a trace, became the very trap that ensnared her. The confidence that once propelled her was now the cage that confined her. It is a humbling lesson. The more we strive for absolute control, the more we risk losing sight of the unpredictable forces that shape our lives and actions. True mastery does not come from dominating every element, but from recognizing the limits of one's influence and embracing the uncertainty that follows. This story serves as a powerful reminder that in the pursuit of perfection, the smallest oversight can carry the heaviest consequence. It challenges us to reconsider our own need for control and to acknowledge that flaws and contradictions, however minor, are often the gateways to truth. The quiet unraveling of this perfect crime is not just a tale of failure. It is a mirror reflecting the universal human struggle with power, deception, and the fragile nature of certainty. Now, we want to hear from you. What detail do you think ultimately exposed her? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your insight might reveal something we missed. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next episode of Perfect Crimes Gone Wrong. where we dive deep into another story where flawless plans meet their match in the smallest, most unexpected ways.